Where is the constitutional authority to rework health care at all? Article 1, Section 8, lay and collect taxes. Our federal government is way, way, way out of bounds here. So here's the question. How do we fix it? Joining me now from Tulsa, Oklahoma, author of the new book, Smashing the D.C. Monopoly, Using Article 5 to Restore Freedom and Stop Runaway Government, former Oklahoma Senator Tom Coburn. Tom, I want to talk about your book, of course. I also want to talk about Obamacare and its ostensibly its replacement in the United States Senate, what's going on there. But first, I want to ask about Senator John McCain. I don't know if you have any inside information. Of course, he had a procedure done, a procedure that was reported as minor, but now we're hearing maybe it wasn't so minor. What do you know?
I don't know anything other than what was in the press. I've left a phone call for him and haven't had it returned.
So we're obviously hoping the best for Senator McCain.
Sure. And you know, there's a range of speculations out there, and it's best that we don't speculate. If he says he'll be back in a week, I don't doubt that he'll be back in a week.
All right. So let's move on to the health care. When I look at what's going on in the United States Senate right now, your colleagues, especially the Republicans, it tells me that something's broken. Not only is the product broken, because this is not a repeal of Obamacare in any way, shape, or form, but I think the process is also broken. Largely, the American people are being left in the dark over this process. Would you agree with that assessment?
I think, I think that's an accurate assessment. I think also what you need to recognize is going on, Graham, is you have people thinking about the next election rather than what's best for the country. I mean, when you've had all these guys vote one way, and then as soon as they're in charge, they're afraid to do that same vote again. What's that tell you? That tells you that they know what is the right thing to do, but they don't have the courage to do it. And the right thing to do is eliminate Obamacare and start over with market price discovery health care, where we help people that need to be helped, but we don't play this game where a third of everything we spend in health care is wasted. And there's lots of studies that show that. That's $800 billion to $1 trillion a year that's spent on health care that doesn't help anybody. Well, we don't have an economic system, a free enterprise system in health care. And so now what we see is the cowardice of expediency, not fixing and not meeting the commitment that the Republicans made. I'm actually with Rand Paul. I know there's a political side to this, but what they ought to do is do what they said they were going to do, restore confidence, and then work on a new program that they can come together and build. In other words, clean repeal of Obamacare? Is that what you're talking about? Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And then do it. Then to say we'll pass a bill that gets rid of it, but we'll also obligate ourselves for 6 months down the road. You got to have this in place, and then figure out what this is. It appears to me that the leadership in the Republican Party in the Senate right now, and in the House for that matter, just want to pass something. Want to say to the American people, hey, we passed a phony repeal and this calamity of a replacement, and then allow the bureaucrats in the fourth branch of government, a la Obama, let's face it, Senator, a la Obama, to retool the thing, and that's a disaster. Well, I think there's a couple of points that needs to be made. Number one, you made it earlier. There isn't any role for the federal government in health care, but we now have it, and we have $100 trillion of unfunded liabilities associated with it that our kids are going to have to pay. You and I are not going to pay it back. So that's the first thing. The second thing, if you really want to know what government health care looks like, go to the VA or the Indian Health Service. That's how you'll find out what real government health care works. Third thing is we're subsidizing the players that make the most money. Whether it's the insurance companies or whether it's the not-for-profit hospitals or the for-profit hospitals, they're highly inefficient, and what they do is they hide price discovery from the average individual. So they can't know before they buy what something's going to cost. So they can't get the best care at the best price. So I think what we need to do is use what we use on 80% of the rest of the economy. It's called the free market system with price transparency. And if they want to pass a bill to actually help Americans with their health care bill, pass a bill that says every price has to be out there and you have to be able to find it and you have to be able to see it. It has to be transparent to you. And we'll lower costs 35% in this country on health care tomorrow. You're also, besides being a former United States Senator, you're also a doctor as an MD. Isn't it important in this entire equation, you talk about the free market, of course, that's
crucial. But we also need to somehow, don't you think, return the doctor-patient relationship in this equation?
Yeah, and you're not going to do that as long as the hospitals own all the doctors. Because their obligation and their loyalty is to the hospital, not to their patient. And they can say otherwise, but when you're limited in what you can do and mandated by the contract you've signed with a hospital provider, you can't necessarily refer your patient to the best care. You have to refer it in network or into somebody in your own hospital. So when it's illegal for a doctor to own a hospital, but it's not illegal for hospitals to own doctors, we have a real problem because we've disrupted the free enterprise system. And the reason the American Hospital Association got that piece of legislation in the Affordable Care Act is they didn't want the competition.
Right.
And what the Federal Trade Commission says today is the best care at the best price with the best outcomes is in physician-owned hospitals who can't expand because it was prohibited in the Affordable Care Act.
And this Medicaid solution is not a solution at all? Eventually,
No.
Medicaid is going to go bankrupt. And you expand out the circle a little bit. This has to do with the larger problem. You mentioned the unfunded liability, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 trillion. We have a $20 trillion national debt. The bottom line is we can't keep going this way. Some of us are sounding the alarm bells, but not enough of Washington, D.C. is taking this seriously, Senator.
Well, I spent 10 years in the U.S. Senate trying to make that point. And the reason I left the U.S. Senate early is you're not going to make it that point up there. And so that's why using Article 5, Convention of the States, to have an amendments convention to restore the balance of power between the states and the federal government and rebalance the relationship between the three branches of federal government, not the four that's now the bureaucratic branch that controls everything. They've never been elected to anything, and they're telling us what to do rather than us, the American people, telling Washington what to do.
Okay, so the bottom line is clearly Washington cannot fix Washington, right? Rejoining me now from Tulsa, Oklahoma, author of the new book, Smashing the D.C. Monopoly, Using Article 5 to Restore Freedom and Stop Runaway Government, former Oklahoma Senator Tom Coburn. Senator, Nancy Pelosi, to me, is a poster child for the argument for term limits, and your book is essentially a roadmap of how to get term limits imposed on members of Congress.
It is, and it's one of the three planks that we are proposing that would actually fix things in Washington. You know, what we've talked about so far is the symptoms of disease that are happening in Washington. But Washington doesn't want to treat the disease treatment. They don't want that treatment. And the treatment is not to drain the swamp. It is to put muzzles on the alligators in the swamp. And the way we do that is through an Article 5 convention of states where we offer amendments to rebalance and restore the federal government to positions that it was intended to have. When I talk to people that are frustrated with the federal government and you tell them, here's a way that you and I can actually make a difference by lobbying our state legislatures and having the states actually pass this resolution for an amendment, all of a sudden they say, hey, I actually can do something. And then we restore power back to us, the people, instead of the unelected bureaucrats and the dysfunctional, factionalized partisanship that you see in Washington.
There is some fear floating out there about triggering an Article 5 convention of the states because, of course, it's never been triggered in our history. And so there's some fear of the unknown. And we're hearing things about a runaway convention and taking away possibly the Second Amendment, modifying the First Amendment. The problem with that argument, Senator, is that, first of all, it takes 34 states to trigger an Article 5 convention of the states. And secondly, it would take 38 states to do away with the Second Amendment. And I believe that we could conjure up 13 states to block a move like that. You agree?
Well, I think there's zero chance of anything untoward happening. What you're hearing is the propagation of fear. This country was built on courage. There is no chance that anything that's harmful to our country will come out of an Article 5 convention because, number one, all it is a suggestion to the states. So that's the number one thing. Number two and three and four, there are 5 or 6 other ways that will not allow that because you can't offer an amendment that's outside of the application that you've made. But finally, you have to assume that there's 13 states there aren't 13 states that love freedom, that love our Bill of Rights. And the fact is we used Article 5 amendment conventions all the time. Matter of fact, the original Constitution Convention came out of Annapolis Convention, which was an Article 5 convention. So what you hear spilled out in terms of the rhetoric is people who are afraid to fix our country because some of them are self-interested in it. Number two, others are just using it to raise money for their own organization to be against something and propagate fear. The third thing is if we don't fix it, who's going to? And what kind of life will we leave to our children and our grandchildren because we failed to do what our founders gave us as the tool to fix when we encounter what we are today? The real question, Graham, is who gets to decide? Is it the bureaucrats in Washington, the moneyed self-interest that influence Washington, that control elections, or is it the American people? And should it be the American people who get to decide? And I for one, think it should be the American people, not the careerists and the elitists and the statists in Washington, D.C.
And as you said, there is precedence. There's never been an Article 5 convention in the states, but of course conventions were commonplace even before 1787. And you point to the Santa Fe Convention in 1922. This was a regional convention, but it also helped establish maybe the procedures, the rules, the delegates and such. And you hit an important point there, and that is if there is a convention convened, that there will be a docket. And on that docket would be, for example, term limits for Congress, term limits for United States Supreme Court members, term limits possibly for lower court members, a balanced budget amendment, possibly abolition of the 16th and the 17th Amendment, what have you. But you cannot deviate from that docket, correct?
That's right. And all it takes is one point of order to say you're outside the application that was made to have this convention, and it's gone. And there's even another safety feature. If, in fact, a convention would propose an amendment outside of its application, the Congress will never send it to the states because there'll be a lawsuit that says this is outside the parameters of this convention, so therefore it's null and void.
All right.
So there's zero likelihood of anything untoward to come out of this, and what you see is fear. And fear is we ought to be afraid of the runaway government that we have today rather than the solution to fix it that our founders gave us.
Your book on page 60 talks about 61 talks about smashing the D.C. monopoly, talks about Congress and its role. Congress, quote, has a legal obligation to call an amendments convention upon the 34th state application to deliberate in convention on a defined subject or subjects. Failure to use the call would be unconstitutional. This is my biggest fear in this process, Senator. If the states do get together, and there's 34 states that recognize the need for a convention of the states, or possibly more, that Congress just sits on this. I know it would be unconstitutional, but where is our redress? Where is the recourse if Congress just sits on this?
Well, there's no problem. The 34 states will meet anyway. It doesn't matter. They have to, by law, call the convention, but the states don't have to. The states can have a convention without them calling it if 34 states agree. So the Congress isn't going to sit on it. Here's what will probably happen, Graham. As we get closer and closer, we're at 12 states now.
Right. As
we get to 24 to 28 states, Congress is going to start looking over its shoulder and say, oh, my goodness, we better get busy doing the things the American people want us to do, fixing the real problems rather than treating the symptoms. And you'll start seeing Congress start working on, why isn't there somebody working on a balanced budget amendment right now in Congress? Why? Because they don't want a balanced budget amendment, because then they'd have to make hard choices, which is what we pay them to do. And they don't want to do that because they might not win the next election. And so the next election trumps all our freedoms, all our future, all our kids' future, because the career politician, the elected elite, are more interested in their future than our country's future.
Well, in your book, you also chronicle how Alexander Hamilton and George Mason, among others, went to the mat for Article 5 for us to use it. And now, in 2017, I would agree, I think now is the time. Senator, thank you for the book, and thank you for your time.
Sign the petition at cosaction.com and get as many of your friends and family to do the same. With your full address, your state legislators will know that you really are their constituents in their district. Our success depends on you, so we're inviting you to be part of history. Let's invoke the constitutional solution that's as big as the problem.